The sun had barely begun to set when the sirens went off, cutting through the quiet of the suburban street. In the blink of an eye, a young man found himself being thrown to the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back. The officers shouted orders, but the man, let's call him Marcus, remained calm, even though he had no idea what was going on. He wasn't some hardened criminal. He wasn't even a troublemaker. But there he was, face pressed against the cold pavement, under the bright flash of police lights. It wasn't until the officers checked his ID that the real shock came. They had been ready to deal with a typical suspect, an uncooperative young man who might fight back or make excuses. What they hadn't expected, though, was what they found on that ID. The name on the card wasn't just any name. It was a name that would stop anyone in their tracks. Marcus' father, a figure whose reputation echoed through the halls of power, wealth, and influence, was no ordinary man. For those of you watching, I know what you're thinking. What does his dad have to do with this arrest? What could possibly be so shocking that it would change the entire course of this situation? Well, let's take a step back. Marcus had grown up in a world where his last name carried weight. He wasn't naive about it. He knew that doors opened for him in ways they didn't for others. But that's not to say he had an easy life. Being the son of someone famous, someone with money and power, meant that every move was scrutinized. Every word was measured. Marcus spent most of his life trying to live up to an image that wasn't his own, trying to prove that he wasn't just his father's shadow. Still, he couldn't deny the privileges he had, even if he didn't always want them. So why, then, was he getting arrested on a quiet street, in the middle of nowhere? What had he done? Was it a misunderstanding, or was something far more complicated happening beneath the surface? As the officers stood there, reading his ID, their expressions slowly shifted from authority to confusion. This was not what they were expecting. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that this arrest, this simple traffic stop that had escalated out of nowhere, was about to turn into something far bigger. Something that could shake their entire department, maybe even the entire city. I know you're dying to know who Marcus' dad is, but here's the thing. What they learned about him, what they discovered in that moment, wasn't just a surprise to the officers. It would be a shock to everyone involved. And Marcus, in that moment, felt a rush of emotions that he couldn't explain. Fear, anger, confusion, but most of all he was wondering, how would this all play out? Would the power and the name that followed him all his life help him now, or would it make things worse? The officers looked at each other in disbelief. The atmosphere shifted from routine to something else, something heavier. They had a decision to make, one that would haunt them in the days to come. Did they know who they were dealing with? Or was there more to this than they could have ever imagined? Now, I know you're sitting there on the edge of your seat, wondering what happened next. Trust me, things are only getting started. Stay with me as we dive deeper into the twists and turns of this story. The truth behind Marcus' arrest is something no one could have predicted, and it's about to explode in a way no one saw coming. The officers stood there, still processing what they had just seen. One of them, a veteran cop named Officer Daniels, looked at Marcus with a mix of confusion and skepticism. He had been on the force long enough to recognize when something felt off, but this was different. He'd expected to arrest a young man, maybe a runaway, a thief, or someone involved in something shady. Instead, he was staring at the son of one of the most influential men in the city. But how could that be? What was Marcus doing here, alone, in a neighborhood far removed from the circles of power and wealth his father moved in? It wasn't long before a second officer, Officer Harris, broke the silence. Daniels, are you sure about this? I mean, that asterisk name. Are you seeing this right? He kept glancing between Marcus and the ID, his voice wavering with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. It was clear they both knew the name on that card. Marcus didn't say a word. He had been through this before, being treated differently because of his father. People thought that because of his last name, he had it easy, that he didn't have to work for anything. But they didn't see the pressure, the expectations, the constant comparisons. He wasn't just Marcus anymore. He was so-and-so's son, a label that stuck to him like glue, no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from it. Officer Daniels glanced down at his radio, his fingers twitching. He was seconds away from calling it in, but something made him hesitate. He'd seen his fair share of high-profile cases, but this was different. This wasn't about some celebrity or politician's child, but someone who had always managed to stay out of the spotlight, someone who hadn't asked for their father's reputation. "Where are you headed, Marcus?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice a little softer now, as if trying to make sense of the situation. "I was just out for a walk," Marcus replied coolly, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He knew the next question would be about his father, and he hated it. He hated being reduced to nothing more than a legacy of someone else's success. But it was too late now. He had to face it. Officer Harris looked at his partner. "Should we call him in?" he asked quietly, referring to Marcus' father. The name had already set off a chain of thoughts in both their minds, and it was clear they were wrestling with the implications of what they had discovered. "Not yet," Daniels replied, still weighing his options. He didn't know what to make of this situation. Part of him knew that Marcus was telling the truth, that he had nothing to do with whatever crime they thought had been committed. But the other part, the part that had been trained to question everything, kept asking, why was this kid, who could have been anywhere in the city, out here in this part of town? What was he hiding? What wasn't adding up? But there was more to Marcus' story than just the arrest. Far more. Growing up in the shadow of his father had always felt like a battle he couldn't win. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. His father, Charles Donovan, was a name people feared and admired in equal measure. He was a self-made billionaire, the CEO of a tech empire that spanned continents. His influence reached into politics, business, even the media. He was a man whose name was synonymous with power. But to Marcus, Charles Donovan was something else entirely, an almost mythical figure who lived in a world that felt distant and unapproachable. Marcus had always been told that he would one day follow in his father's footsteps, but Marcus wasn't sure he wanted that. He was tired of the high society parties, the endless stream of meetings and photo shoots, the constant whispers about how he was supposed to be the next great businessman, the heir to a throne he never asked for. It was as if everyone saw him as a tool, a necessary extension of his father's empire. And in that life, there was no room for individuality, no room for mistakes. When Marcus had turned 18, he left the family estate. He wanted to prove to himself and to the world that he was more than just the product of his father's success. He had always been a quiet kid, introspective, and a little rebellious. He wanted to live on his own terms, away from the suffocating gaze of his father's shadow. But it wasn't easy. The world wasn't kind to a young man trying to make his own way when his last name was attached to such a high profile. That was why, in the quiet moments between all the chaos of his life, Marcus found solace in the smaller things, like walking down an unfamiliar street, away from the glitter and the cameras. But even here, he wasn't free. The police had no idea who they were dealing with, but Marcus knew the truth. It wasn't just a random arrest. This was bigger than some random misunderstanding. Something was at play here, something that was going to change everything for him. As Officer Daniels and Officer Harris continued to debate their next move, Marcus stayed silent. He wasn't scared. He was used to the feeling of being judged, to the weight of assumptions being made about who he was. But this time felt different. This time, he could feel something shifting. The tension was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. "You know who I am, don't you?" Marcus asked, his voice almost too calm. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He just needed them to understand. If they only knew the truth, maybe they'd stop treating him like some pawn in a game he didn't want to play. Officer Harris looked uneasy. He had seen his fair share of high-profile cases, but this one was personal. He had been working for the department long enough to recognize when things weren't adding up, And he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a random arrest. The name on Marcus' ID was one thing, but it was the way the young man was carrying himself, the quiet confidence that made Harris uneasy. "I don't know what you're talking about," Harris finally said, his voice steady, though the uncertainty was still there. Marcus shook his head. "It's not about me," he said, more to himself than to them. "It's about what happens next." Daniels and Harris exchanged another glance, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Neither of them knew what would happen if they called Marcus father. They had no idea what kind of storm they were about to unleash. But one thing was for certain: this was no ordinary arrest, and it wasn't going to end the way they expected. The tension in the air thickened, and as the minutes ticked by, it felt like everything was hanging by a thread. What had started as a routine stop was now something much larger, something that was about to unravel in a way no one could have predicted. And Marcus, he knew that this was only the beginning. He had no idea what was coming next, but he could feel it in his bones. Things were about to change, and there was no turning back now. The silence between the officers and Marcus felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm that everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict how or when it would hit. Officer Daniels stood still, his hand still hovering over the radio, unsure whether to call in Marcus' father. There was a gnawing feeling in his gut that told him this wasn't just a random traffic stop gone wrong. He had seen enough in his years on the force to recognize when things were about to spiral, and this situation had the unmistakable scent of a disaster waiting to unfold. Marcus remained eerily calm, watching the two officers wrestle with their thoughts. He could see the doubt in their eyes. They were caught between doing their job and the heavy weight of what they had just discovered. What they didn't know, and what Marcus wasn't about to tell them, was how much more complicated this moment was about to get. His father's name alone could change the entire course of this encounter, but Marcus also knew that calling his father would only make things worse. It always did. As Daniels hesitated, trying to figure out whether to make the call, he found himself thinking back to his own son. A few years younger than Marcus, his kid was the exact opposite: loud, energetic, always looking for trouble. Yet, even with his rebellious streak, Daniels couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in Marcus' shoes. Growing up with the pressure of being the heir to a billion-dollar empire, under constant scrutiny, with expectations that weighed like 1,000 pounds on your shoulders. The more Daniels thought about it, the more he realized how little he understood. What could Marcus have possibly done to end up in this situation? Officer Harris, on the other hand, was struggling with his own set of emotions. He had grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. He wasn't accustomed to high-profile cases, especially not ones like this, where the stakes were far higher than anything he had ever encountered. But more than that, he felt a sense of guilt. Guilt because he had judged Marcus too quickly. The moment they'd pulled him over, he had assumed he was just another reckless kid, possibly a criminal or someone hiding from the law. Now, knowing who his father was, Harris couldn't help but wonder if they had misjudged everything. "Maybe we should just call it in," Harris finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was hesitant, but it was clear he had made up his mind. "We don't know what we're dealing with here, Daniels." But before Daniels could respond, Marcus spoke again, his tone sharp but controlled. "No, don't call him." His voice held an edge now. "This isn't about my father. This is about me." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We both know who your father is, and whether you like it or not, that changes things." Marcus shook his head. "It doesn't. Not like you think." His voice trembled, just for a moment, before he steadied himself. "This is bigger than that. I don't want his help. I don't want to be saved by his money or his name. I need to fix this on my own." But it wasn't that simple. Marcus knew that much. He had spent his entire life trying to escape the shadow of his father, but no matter how hard he tried, it always found a way to reach him. There was a danger in this. Marcus had spent the last few years quietly building a life for himself, one that wasn't defined by the wealth or the power of the Donovan name. But now, that name was about to come crashing back into his life in a way he couldn't control. No matter how much he wanted to fix things on his own, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about him anymore. Meanwhile, back at the Donovan mansion, Charles Donovan was having his own battle. He had been alerted about his son's arrest, and despite his usual calm demeanor, he was furious. This was not how things were supposed to go. Marcus was supposed to stay out of trouble, to live a quiet life, to prepare for the inevitable day when he would take over the family business. But Charles knew his son too well. Marcus had always resisted the path his father had laid out for him, always running in the opposite direction, trying to carve out his own identity. It frustrated Charles to no end, but he didn't want to admit it. He loved his son, even if they didn't always understand each other. Charles paced through the halls of his mansion, speaking in clipped tones to his lawyer, trying to control the situation from a distance. But deep down, he knew that his influence alone couldn't protect Marcus from the consequences of his actions. Not this time. It wasn't just about legal maneuvering or paying someone off to make the problem disappear. There were deeper forces at play now, forces that could unravel everything Charles had worked so hard to build. And Marcus, as much as he wanted to handle things on his own, was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. Back on the street, the officers were still at an impasse. The weight of the situation hung heavy between them, the tension building like the storm Daniels had felt earlier. They knew that one wrong move could escalate this. If they called in Marcus' father, it might be over before it even began. But if they didn't, what would happen to Marcus then? Would they be abandoning him to face something far bigger than they could possibly understand? Officer Daniels exhaled sharply, wiping a hand across his forehead. "What if he's telling the truth?" he asked, more to himself than to Harris. "What do you mean?" Harris asked, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "I mean, what if this isn't about his father? What if he's just a kid in trouble, trying to figure things out?" Harris stared at Daniels for a long moment before shaking his head. "But that doesn't make sense. I mean, look at him. The name on his ID is one of the most powerful names in the city. Do you think anyone in his position just wanders around like this?" Daniels didn't have an answer. He didn't know what to think anymore. All he knew was that this moment was about to change everything. What had started as a routine stop was quickly becoming something far bigger. The questions swirling around Marcus weren't just about his father's legacy anymore. They were about Marcus himself, and the choices he was making in the face of everything that had been handed to him. Choices that, it seemed, might ultimately determine the course of his life. But those choices came with consequences, ones that no one, not even Marcus, could predict. As the minutes dragged on, the quiet tension between the officers and Marcus thickened, each of them trying to make sense of a situation that was far beyond their control. Whatever happened next, it was clear that this was no longer just a simple arrest. It was the beginning of something much more dangerous, and nobody, not even Marcus, could escape the consequences of what was coming. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever, the silence between Marcus and the officers growing thicker with each passing second. Marcus could feel the eyes of the two officers boring into him, that hesitation palpable. He could see the conflict playing out behind their expressions. Two men who were trained to act quickly, who had been taught to deal with any situation, but who were now paralyzed by the weight of the name they had just uncovered. It wasn't about the arrest anymore. It was about something far bigger, something neither of them fully understood. Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the ground, his wrists aching from the tight cuffs. He didn't want to beg, didn't want to play the victim, but in that moment, all he wanted was for this to end. His mind raced, wondering if his father had already been alerted, if Charles Donovan was already preparing to swoop in and solve this. Marcus didn't want that. He wanted to handle this on his own, but the pressure was mounting. He could already feel the eyes of the city on him, waiting for him to fail, to prove that he wasn't capable of standing on his own without the crutch of his father's name and wealth. Suddenly, Daniels broke the silence, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You sure about this, Marcus?" he asked, the uncertainty in his tone evident. "You don't want us to make that call?" We could clear this up in a second. We could make it go away. Marcus shook his head, his jaw tightening. No, he said firmly. I don't want it to go away. I want you to see me for who I am, not who my father is. For a long moment, Daniels didn't respond. The street lights above flickered, casting an eerie glow of the scene. Harris shifted on his feet, glancing nervously between Marcus and his partner. Both men were wrestling with the decision. They had seen their fair share of privileged young people in trouble, but Marcus wasn't like the others. He wasn't flaunting his status, he wasn't making excuses. In fact, he was doing the exact opposite, trying to distance himself from it, even though that was impossible. But the name Donovan meant something. It meant power, influence, and protection. A single phone call could change everything, and that was what scared both officers. Because the more they thought about it, the more they realized that this wasn't just a simple case of a young man in trouble. This was the son of Charles Donovan, the man whose empire spanned continents, whose influence could bring down governments and alter markets with a single word. The officers were no strangers to power and corruption, but this was different. This wasn't just a case of an influential figure making things go away. This was about Marcus, about a young man caught between the weight of his father's legacy and his desperate desire to break free from it. And no one, not even the officers, could predict how this was going to unfold. I can't just let this go, Marcus, Daniels said finally, his voice strained. We've got a job to do. We've got to process this properly. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breath. He wasn't sure if he was angry or afraid, but something inside him was pushing him to stay calm, to stay strong. His entire life had been a fight to be seen as his own person, to break away from the chains of his father's name. And now it felt like he was standing on the edge of losing everything. You don't understand, Marcus said, his voice almost a whisper. It's not just about me. It's about the things my father has done, the things he's involved in. If you let him fix this, it'll just be one more time I'm dragged into his world. One more time he'll decide everything for me, and I can't take that anymore. The officers exchanged glances. They weren't sure what Marcus meant by that, but they could see the desperation in his eyes. The last few words he'd spoken, about his father's involvement in something darker, something dangerous, hung heavy in the air. What was he talking about? What did his father's name really mean? Before either of the officers could respond, Marcus' phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration sending a jolt through his body. For a split second, he wondered if it was his father. The thought made his stomach turn. But when he looked at the screen, his heart sank. It wasn't his father. It was a text message from someone else, someone from his past. The message was simple, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. Asterisk, they know you're involved. They're coming for you. Stay where you are, asterisk. Marcus' hand shook as he read the message again, his thoughts spiraling. What the hell does that mean? He muttered to himself, barely loud enough for the officers to hear. Daniels noticed the change in Marcus' demeanor immediately. He could see the fear in his eyes now, the tension in his body. Something had shifted, but what? Harris stepped forward, his voice uncertain. Who's coming for you, Marcus? What's going on? Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked up at the sky, as if searching for answers in the stars. His mind was racing. Who had sent that message? And more importantly, who was coming for him? He had been trying so hard to distance himself from his father's world, from the dark undercurrents of power that followed Charles Donovan wherever he went. But now, it seemed like those forces were closing in on him, whether he liked it or not. Before he could answer, the sound of distant sirens reached his ears, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus felt his heart beat faster, the adrenaline surging through his veins. Was it the police? Was it his father's people, coming to take control of the situation? The officers turned, their eyes darting to the flashing lights in the distance. What the hell is that? Harris asked, his voice low. Marcus didn't have the answer. All he knew was that whatever was about to happen, it was coming fast. and he had no idea whether he would be able to escape the web that had been spun around him. The sirens grew louder, their wail echoing off the buildings as they neared. Marcus could feel his chest tightening, his breath quickening. The fear that had started as a small seed inside him had now grown into something much bigger, something he couldn't ignore. Who were the sirens for? Was it the police, coming to finish what they had started? Or was it someone else? Someone far more dangerous? Daniels and Harris exchanged uneasy glances, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters as the lights flashed brighter and the sound of the sirens drew closer. But as they looked toward the source, their confusion only deepened. The vehicles weren't headed directly toward them. Instead, they were slowing, coming to a stop several blocks away. Something felt wrong. Marcus' heart raced, his mind swirling with 1,000 questions. The text message was still fresh in his mind. Asterisk, they're coming for you, asterisk. But who exactly was coming for him? And why? He had no enemies, not the kind of enemies who would send ominous messages. But then again, he had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes of his father's empire. Maybe he was only just beginning to understand how deep this ran. Before he could process anything further, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the corner. It was a car he recognized immediately, though it had never been in his life directly. His father's security team. A group of faceless, ruthless individuals who answered only to Charles Donovan. They weren't cops. They weren't here to arrest him. They were here to take him, or at least that was what it looked like. His gut twisted. Marcus had been running from this his entire life, the cold, calculating world of his father, where nothing was left to chance. No one ever truly left it. And now, here it was, closing in on him with the full force of his father's control. The door of the SUV swung open, and 2 men stepped out, wearing dark suits and earpieces, their expressions impassive. They moved quickly, their eyes scanning the scene with a precision that felt suffocating. Marcus instinctively stepped back, his mind still racing to process what was happening. It was clear now, his father had found him. It didn't matter where he went, how far he tried to escape. Marcus had always known, deep down, that his father's influence stretched farther than he could run. "Marcus," one of the men said, his voice smooth and professional, "you need to come with us. Now." It wasn't a request, it was an order. Marcus' heart hammered in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to run, to flee, to do anything to get away from the suffocating grip of his father's world. But the officers were still there, watching, uncertain. Daniels and Harris stood frozen in place, torn between doing their duty and realizing the depth of the situation unfolding before them. The officers hadn't expected this. They had assumed, perhaps naively, that Marcus' arrest was just a mistake, a case of mistaken identity or something that could be quickly sorted out. But now it was clear. Marcus wasn't just some kid on the street. He was someone who had been pulled into a world of power and danger far beyond what they understood. "Who are they?" Officer Harris asked, his voice strained, glancing between the men in suits and Marcus. "They're here to take me," Marcus said, his voice shaking but resolute. He didn't look at them, though. His eyes were locked on the men who were approaching. He had no doubt in his mind. This wasn't about the cops anymore. This wasn't a matter of arresting him for whatever small thing they thought he had done. This was something bigger, something that couldn't be undone. Daniel's brow furrowed, his grip tightening on the radio, but the sense of helplessness in his posture was palpable. They weren't trained for this kind of situation. They were police officers, yes, but they weren't equipped to handle the kind of power dynamics that were unfolding in front of them. They weren't prepared to face the kind of world that was now marching toward them. One of the men in the suit approached Marcus slowly, his movements deliberate. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "But we can't let you stay here. Your father is expecting you. Now." The words stung. Asterisk, your father is expecting you, asterisk, as if Marcus had a choice in the matter. As if he could somehow erase everything he had been running from. Marcus swallowed hard. You could feel the weight of the officer's stares on him, and in that moment, he knew something that chilled him to his core. No matter how much he wanted to escape, no matter how hard he fought against it, his father's influence was never far behind. And now, his world was closing in on him faster than he could comprehend. The SUV doors swung open, and more figures emerged, their presence an unmistakable signal that the situation had gone far beyond Marcus' control. The officers seemed to realize it too, and Daniels stepped forward, his voice tense. "Hold on," he said, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "This is still a police matter. He's under arrest. You can't just..." One of the men in the suit turned his gaze to Daniels, his eyes cold. "This is not your jurisdiction anymore," he said, his voice smooth, but dripping with a threat that left no room for argument. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The words hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, his hand trembling slightly as he glanced at Harris. The officers were outmatched, outgunned. They were witnessing something far beyond their pay grade, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Marcus felt the walls closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of his past. He had no choice now. His father's world had found him, and no amount of resistance could change that. But just as the men began to approach, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and urgent. "Wait." The shout came from the distance, from an unfamiliar figure sprinting toward the group. It was a woman, dressed in a sharp suit, her face set in a determined expression, her eyes locked on Marcus. She wasn't one of his father's people, but the way she moved, confident, purposeful, told him that she wasn't someone to be ignored. The crowd around them paused, the men in suits halting in their tracks. Everyone turned, Marcus included, toward the newcomer, as she closed the gap. And in that brief moment, Marcus realized that what was happening now might not be the end. It might just be the beginning of a much deeper game, one that would shake everything he thought he knew. Her words, when she spoke them, hit like a lightning bolt. "I'm here to take him. You've got no idea who's really coming for him." The stakes had just been raised. The woman's sudden appearance sent a ripple through the tense standoff. Marcus stood frozen, uncertain whether he should feel relief or dread. Her confident stride, the authoritative way she held herself, suggested that she wasn't just another bystander. She was someone who belonged in this world, the world of power, secrets, and influence. The men in suits, who had been closing in on Marcus, turned toward her with narrowed eyes. The leader of the group, the man who had spoken to Marcus just moments earlier, took a step forward, his posture stiffening. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the thick air. The woman didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto Marcus briefly, and then she turned her gaze back to the men. "I'm the person you should have been waiting for," she said, her voice steady, laced with an authority that made everyone pause. "You don't get to take him anywhere. Not yet." Marcus, still trying to process everything happening around him, felt a chill run down his spine. Who was she? And more importantly, why had she come now? His mind raced through possible explanations, but none of them made sense. Was she from his father's inner circle, a rival trying to take him for some other reason? Or was there something else, something even darker at play? The leader of the group didn't seem impressed by her confidence. "You're too late," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "He's ours now." But the woman wasn't backing down. "Not anymore. You've been handling the wrong side of this deal for too long." Marcus felt the tension in the air shift. The men in suits were visibly unsettled now. The woman's presence was enough to throw them off balance. The fight for control of the situation, it seemed, was no longer just about his father's power or the arrest. It was about something far more complicated. Harris and Daniels stood to the side, still unsure how to proceed. They had no idea who this woman was, but it was clear she wasn't intimidated. Her calm, controlled manner suggested she had the kind of influence that could reshape everything happening in this moment. Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his desperation finally breaking through. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know who he was up against. The woman met his gaze, her expression softening just a fraction. "My name is Elena Hayes," she said, her voice lower now, almost comforting. "And I'm the reason your father's empire is falling apart." The words hit Marcus like a thunderclap. His father's empire, falling apart. The very foundation of everything Charles Donovan had built over the years, was it crumbling? The question burned in his mind, but the answers felt elusive. "Elena." Marcus whispered the name as if testing it, his mind spinning. You're the one who's been leaking information." She nodded, the weight of her actions evident in her eyes. "I've been trying to get you out of this for a long time, Marcus," she said. "But your father's grip is tighter than you think. He's got his fingers in everything. And now it's all about to unravel." Marcus stared at her, confused and overwhelmed. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What's happening? How do you know all this?" Elena's eyes darkened as she glanced over her shoulder at the men in suits. "They're not here to protect you. They're here to make sure you don't get away. But you have no idea what they're really working for. They're just pawns in a game much bigger than they realize." The words left Marcus reeling. This was bigger than his father. Bigger than him. He was just a piece in something that had been unfolding for years, something much darker than he could have ever imagined. The leader of the men in suits stepped forward again, his eyes flashing with menace. "Enough with the games," he said, his voice tight with fury. "You're both coming with us, and there's nothing you can do about it." But Elena wasn't afraid. She smiled, a knowing smile, as if she had anticipated this moment. Without another word, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small device. An unassuming little thing, no bigger than a smartphone. She held it up, pressing a button on the side. A low, ominous beep echoed in the air, followed by a strange whirring sound. The men in suits froze. Something was happening, something they hadn't expected. Marcus watched in disbelief as a few of the men exchanged nervous glances. "What the hell did you just do?" the leader barked, his voice turning sharp. Elena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at Marcus, her gaze filled with determination. "I've been working to bring down your father's empire from the inside. The information I've leaked, it's been building up, Marcus. It's all been building to this moment." Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the street. The sound of shattering glass and the screech of metal filled the air. The force of it knocked Marcus off his feet, sending him sprawling to the ground. The sirens blared in the distance, but this wasn't the usual sound of a police chase. This was something else, a sign that things had escalated beyond anyone's control. When Marcus pushed himself up, dazed, he saw the SUV in front of him engulfed in flames. The men who had been surrounding him, the men who had worked for his father, were now scrambling in the chaos. Their carefully laid plans shattered in an instant. Elena had set something in motion, something so powerful that it had completely overturned the power dynamics at play. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The fire illuminated the darkened street, casting long shadows. The police sirens grew louder, but the chaos now felt unstoppable. The truth that Elena had hinted at, the game being played behind the scenes, was no longer something Marcus could ignore. His father's empire was crumbling, but it wasn't because of any one person's betrayal. And then, as if to confirm the turmoil of everything that had just happened, Elena turned to Marcus with a final cryptic smile. "The real battle is just beginning. Your father won't be the one pulling the strings anymore, but you will need to decide where you stand." Before Marcus could respond, she disappeared into the chaos, leaving him standing there, with only questions in his mind and a world of uncertainty ahead of him. As the flames of the burning SUV crackled in the night, Marcus realized the game was far from over. The true nature of his father's empire, and the role he would play in it, was only just beginning to unfold, and the final twist of this dark story had yet to reveal itself. As the chaos of the explosion continued to echo in the night, Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing. The fire that consumed the black SUV was a symbol of something much bigger than just an accident or a random act of violence. It was a signal, a warning that everything he thought he knew about his life, about his father, was about to change forever. The flashing lights of the approaching police cars were growing louder, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to move. His legs felt heavy, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up to him. Elena's last words echoed in his mind. The real battle is just beginning. Your father won't be the one pulling the strings anymore. But what did that mean? What was happening behind the scenes that he still didn't understand? His gaze drifted back to the wreckage, and he saw the men in suits, the ones who had been sent to take him, scrambling in the aftermath of the explosion. It was clear now that whatever Elena had set in motion, it was too powerful for them to control. They had been pawns, just as Elena had said, and now they were caught in the same web of power that they thought they could manipulate. But what did all of this mean for Marcus? He had no answers, just a deep sense of uncertainty. The path ahead of him was shrouded in mystery, and he knew there was no going back to the life he once knew. He had been thrust into a world far darker than he could have imagined, and there was no escaping it now. The sirens grew louder still, and finally, Marcus took a deep breath, his mind made up. He had to face whatever came next, even if it terrified him. He couldn't run any longer. His father's empire, the one he had been trying to avoid, was crumbling, and whether he liked it or not, Marcus was going to be a part of what came next. As the police cars screeched to a halt, Daniels and Harris rushed over to him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. "Marcus, are you okay?" Daniels asked, his voice shaky. Marcus nodded slowly, his thoughts still racing. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping away from him, like sand through his fingers. "What the hell happened here?" Harris asked, his eyes wide as he glanced at the wreckage of the SUV. "Who were those guys? And what about that woman?" Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze shifting toward the distant glow of the flames. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: the woman, Elena, had been right. His father's empire was collapsing, and it was no longer about just the arrests or the betrayal. It was about power, control, and the people who had spent years manipulating everything from behind the scenes. "I don't know," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. "But I think I need to find out." Daniels and Harris exchanged another uneasy glance. They had no idea what Marcus had just witnessed, what he had just learned, but they could sense a shift in him, the way he was no longer the same person who had been brought in by the police only hours before. Whatever had happened tonight had changed him. The fire burned brightly in the distance, casting long shadows on the pavement, but Marcus barely noticed it now. He had seen enough to know that this was just the beginning. The game that had been set in motion, by Elena, by his father, by forces he still didn't fully understand, was far from over. As the police moved in to secure the scene, Marcus turned away, his steps steady, though his mind was still clouded with questions. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He had to find answers. He had to find Elena. The next few days were a blur. Marcus reached out to people from his past, trying to piece together the fragmented information Elena had given him. He dug into the records of his father's business dealings, finding nothing but a trail of shadowy figures and deals that didn't make sense. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. His father's empire wasn't just about money or power. It was about control over people, over governments, of the very systems that ran the world. But Marcus wasn't ready to confront that reality yet. The information was overwhelming, and he still wasn't sure where Elena fit into it all. She had been an ally, but in the end, she was as much a part of the complex web of power as his father was. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she had her own agenda. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself caught in a strange limbo. He wasn't part of the police investigation anymore, but neither was he free from the shadow of his father's legacy. He spent his days digging, searching for Elena, and trying to make sense of what had happened. His nights were filled with restless dreams, filled with images of the burning SUV, of Elena's warning, and of his father's cold, unfeeling gaze. Then, just when Marcus thought he had reached the end of his search, a phone call changed everything. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end wasn't. It was Elena. "Marcus," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "You've been asking a lot of questions, but the answers aren't as simple as you think." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice tight with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Why are you doing this?" "I'm trying to help you," Elena replied, "but you need to understand something. You're not the only one who's been trying to escape this world. Your father is more dangerous than you realize, but he's losing control. What I've been doing, what we've both been doing, isn't about taking him down. It's about freeing everyone he's kept in chains." Marcus felt a chill run through him. He had been part of something much bigger than he had ever understood. And now Elena was offering him a choice: to walk away, to leave it all behind, or to step into the world his father had built, with all its power and corruption. "I don't know if I can do this," Marcus said quietly. "I don't know if I'm ready to face it." "You don't have to be ready," Elena said softly. "You just have to decide who you're going to be." And with that, the line went dead. Marcus stared at the phone in his hand, his mind spinning. For the first time in his life, he realized that the choice was his. He could walk away from it all, let it all burn to the ground, or he could step into the fire and fight for something bigger than himself. The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was: Marcus was no longer running from his past. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it.